This 1871 mother and infant photo looks serene until you notice the tag on the blanket. At first glance, it seemed like a tender portrait of new life. A young black woman cradling her newborn, her expression calm, the baby swaddled in spotless white cloth. It was the kind of image that might hang in a museum with a caption about freedom, resilience, or family after emancipation. But one archivist could not stop staring at the corner of that blanket. And what she found there would unravel a story that stretched back further than the photo and forward into questions that still have no comfortable answers. Nadine Colbert had worked at a university archive in Jackson, Mississippi for 11 years. She specialized in what the department called vernacular photography, the everyday images that families kept in shoeboxes and albums, the portraits made by itinerant photographers who traveled dirt roads with portable darkrooms. Most of these images came to the archive through estate donations or quiet transfers from historical societies that lacked the resources to store them properly. Nadine had cataloged thousands of them, portraits of white families posed stiffly on front porches, tintypes of soldiers in faded uniforms, wedding pictures, funeral pictures, pictures of children who did not survive the year. This photograph arrived in a batch from a shuttered county museum in the Delta region. The museum had closed after decades of declining attendance and a roof that finally gave way during a spring storm. The county had offered its entire collection to the university, and Nadine's team had spent weeks sorting through water-damaged ledgers, taxidermied birds, and boxes of photographs that smelled of mildew and age. The image of the mother and infant was in better condition than most. It was an albumen print, roughly 4 by 6 inches, mounted on a stiff cardboard backing. The edges were worn soft, as if it had been handled many times over the years. The mother looked young, perhaps 18 or 19, with her hair wrapped in a plain cloth. Her dress was simple but clean, the fabric a dark cotton. She held the infant close to her chest, both hands supporting the bundle with careful attention. Her face was composed, but there was something watchful in her eyes. The baby's face was mostly hidden by the blanket, just a curve of cheek and a small fist visible above the white fabric. Nadine turned the photograph over. The backing was blank, except for a faint pencil notation in the upper corner. Colson Place, 1871. She turned it back and looked at the image again. It was beautiful in the way that surviving photographs from this era often were. The fact that a black woman and her infant had been photographed at all in rural Mississippi in 1871 was notable. Most black families in the Delta during Reconstruction could not afford portraits, and most white photographers did not seek them out as customers. This photograph suggested something unusual. Family with some resources, or a photographer with uncommon interests. Nadine set the image under her magnifying lamp and began her usual inspection. She looked at the background first. It was a simple cloth backdrop, probably hung by the photographer to create a neutral field. No props, no furniture. Then she looked at the mother's clothing. The dress appeared homemade, sturdy but not fashionable. No jewelry, no lace. Then the infant. The blanket was the brightest object in the frame, a clean white that almost seemed to glow against the darker tones around it. And then Nadine saw it. In the lower left corner of the blanket, where the fabric folded over the infant's feet, there was a faint mark. She adjusted the lamp and leaned closer. It was a stamp, faded but legible under magnification, 2 lines of text pressed into the cloth, the kind of mark used by institutional laundries to track linens. The first line read, Colson Plantation. The second line read, Hospital Ward. Nadine sat back. The photograph was dated 1871. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in 1865. The Colson Plantation, whatever it had been, should not have existed as a functioning institution 6 years after emancipation. And yet, here was a blanket, clearly marked with plantation laundry stamps, wrapped around a newborn child. This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Nadine had learned over the years to trust the feeling that came when an image did not sit right. It was a kind of dissonance, a gap between what the photograph seemed to show and what the details implied. Most of the time, the dissonance turned out to be nothing. A misidentified date, a common name shared by unrelated families. But sometimes, rarely, the dissonance was a door. She photographed the original print at high resolution and emailed the files to herself. Then, she placed the image in an acid-free sleeve and locked it in her desk drawer. She would not add it to the general collection yet, not until she understood what she was looking at. The next morning, Nadine began with the obvious questions. Who were the Colsons? What was the Colson plantation? And why would a plantation hospital blanket be in use 6 years after slavery ended? Mississippi land records from the antebellum period were scattered across multiple repositories, but the name Colson appeared quickly enough. James Randolph Colson had owned a cotton plantation in Bolivar County from the 1840s until his death in 1863. The plantation had been substantial, over 2,000 acres, with an enslaved population recorded in the 1860 census at 147 people. When Colson died without a direct heir, the land passed to a nephew, Edward Colson, who had served briefly in the Confederate Army before a leg wound sent him home. After the war, Edward Colson had done what many planters in the Delta did. He kept the land and converted to a sharecropping system. The formerly enslaved workers stayed on, now nominally free but bound by labor contracts that left them perpetually in debt. They worked the same fields, lived in the same cabins, and answered to the same overseer, a man named Hiram Galt, who had managed the plantation before the war and continued afterward. This much was ordinary. It was the story of 1,000 plantations across the South. But Nadine found something else in the county records that made her pause. In 1867, Edward Colson had filed papers with the county registering a freedmen's settlement on his property. The settlement was given a name, Colson Camp. According to the filing, the camp would provide housing, supplies, and medical care to formerly enslaved people and their families in exchange for contracted labor. The language was bureaucratic and bland, the kind of document that could be waved at Freedmen's Bureau agents to demonstrate compliance with the new order. But attached to the filing was a schedule of fees. Rent for a cabin, deducted from wages. Seed and tools, deducted from wages. Medical care, deducted from wages. Burial costs, deducted from wages. And at the bottom of the list, a line that made Nadine read it twice. Registration of births, deaths, and transfers, $2 per entry, deducted from wages. The plantation was charging families for the right to have their children's births recorded. Nadine called a colleague at the Southern History Center in Atlanta, a historian named Marcus Treadwell, who specialized in post-emancipation labor systems. She read him the line from the document. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's not unusual for the period," he said. "Planners found all kinds of ways to keep people tied to the land. Charging for record keeping was one of them. If a family couldn't pay the fee, their children wouldn't be registered. And if the children weren't registered, they couldn't prove their age, their parentage, or their freedom. They became legal ghosts." "But this is 1867, Nadine said. "The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to be tracking all of this." "The Bureau was understaffed and underfunded," Marcus said. "In a place like Bolivar County, they might have had one agent covering 100 square miles. If a planter said he was handling registration himself, the Bureau often took him at his word. They didn't have the resources to check." Nadine asked about the hospital stamp on the blanket. Marcus said that many plantations had maintained crude infirmaries during slavery, places where sick or injured workers were kept so they could be returned to the fields as quickly as possible. Women giving birth were sometimes taken to these wards as well. After the war, Marcus said, some of these infirmaries kept operating. The planters called them hospitals or clinics and charged freed people for using them. The linens, the beds, the equipment, it was all just repurposed from the slave system. Nobody bought new supplies when the old ones still worked. Nadine thought about the blanket in the photograph. Clean and white, carefully wrapped around a newborn. It looked like care. It looked like tenderness. But the stamp in the corner told a different story. That blanket had been used in a plantation hospital ward before the war, when the woman holding it would have been property. And now, 6 years after emancipation, her child was being wrapped in the same cloth, registered in the same ledgers, bound by the same debts. The photograph was not a portrait of freedom. It was evidence of something else entirely. Over the following weeks, Nadine dug deeper into the Colson records. The county courthouse in Cleveland, Mississippi, had preserved a partial set of plantation ledgers from the post-war period. Most were financial records, columns of numbers tracking cotton yields, supply purchases, and wage calculations. But one ledger was different. It was labeled Camp Register and contained names, dates, and brief notations in a cramped handwriting. The register tracked the population of Colson Camp from 1866 to 1879. Each entry included a name, an approximate age, a family grouping, and a status. The statuses were simple: laborer, dependent, infirm, or deceased. New arrivals were noted with the word born or arrived. Departures were noted with died, transferred, or occasionally absconded. Nadine found the entry she was looking for on page 47. In April 1871, a woman named Louisa, age 19, was recorded as giving birth to a daughter. The infant was given the name Clara. The notation beside the entry read, "Blanket issued, Ward 2, fee applied." The photograph now had a name, Louisa and Clara. But the ledger also revealed something troubling. In the years between 1866 and 1879, the register recorded 38 births at Colson Camp. Of those 38 children, 23 were marked as deceased before their 5th birthday. The causes of death, when listed at all, were vague: fever, weakness, summer complaint. One entry simply said stillborn, though the child had been assigned a name and a blanket fee. Nadine contacted a pediatrician at the University Medical Center, a woman named Dr. Renee Ashford, who had published on infant mortality in the post-war South. She showed her the numbers. Dr. Ashford shook her head slowly. A 60% mortality rate for children under 5 is catastrophic, but it's consistent with what we know about these labor camps. The families were malnourished, the housing was poor, there was no clean water, no sanitation. And the so-called hospitals were often worse than useless. They reused linens without washing them properly. They had no understanding of infection. A woman giving birth in one of those wards was exposed to whatever diseases had passed through before her. She paused. The blanket in your photograph, if it had been used in a slave hospital before the war and kept in circulation afterward, it could have carried pathogens for years. Cholera, typhoid, puerperal fever, these were invisible. Killers and the people running the camps had no idea and no incentive to care. Nadine asked what happened to the children who survived. Dr. Ashford said the ones who made it past 5 often grew up to become laborers themselves, entering the same debt cycle as their parents. The registration fees were part of that system. If a family owed money for a birth, that debt was added to their account. If the child died, the family still owed the fee. And if the child lived, they might eventually be expected to work off the debt themselves. It was a form of inherited bondage. Nadine returned to the ledger and traced the entry for Clara. The infant born in April 1871 appeared again in the 1872 column, still listed as a dependent, then again in 1873, then 1874. In 1875, the notation beside her name changed. It no longer said dependent. It said laborer, half share. Clara was 4 years old. The photograph of Louisa and Clara took on a new weight. That serene image of a mother holding her newborn was also a record of a system designed to extract labor and debt from black families for generations. The blanket was not just a blanket. It was a piece of infrastructure recycled from slavery into something that looked different but functioned the same way. Nadine knew she had to bring this to the archive's leadership. The photograph had been donated as part of a general collection, but it was now clear that it documented something specific and deeply troubling. The question was what to do with that knowledge. She requested a meeting with Dr. Harold Vance, the director of the archive, and presented her findings. She showed him the photograph, the ledger entries, the registration fees, the mortality data. She explained the connection between the blanket stamp and the ongoing exploitation of freed people at Colson Camp. Dr. Vance listened carefully. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is significant research," he said finally, "but I want to be cautious about how we present it. The Colson family still has descendants in this state. Some of them are donors to the university. If we build an exhibit around this photograph and frame it as evidence of, what would you call it, post-slavery exploitation, there will be pushback." Nadine had expected this. "The photograph is evidence," she said. The ledgers are evidence. I'm not inventing a narrative. I'm reading what's there. I understand that, Dr. Vance said, but interpretation is always a choice. We could display this image as a portrait of a freed woman and her child, a testament to resilience and survival, without emphasizing the darker context. That would still be true. It would just be simpler. It would also be incomplete, Nadine said, and it would erase exactly the people this photograph is supposed to remember. The meeting ended without a resolution. Dr. Vance said he would consult with the university's communications office and the development team. He asked Nadine to hold off on any public statements until he had a chance to assess the situation. Nadine returned to her office and sat with the photograph. She thought about Louisa, 19 years old, holding her daughter in a room set up by an itinerant photographer. Had she known what the stamp on the blanket meant? Had she chosen that blanket, or had it been handed to her? Did she understand that her daughter's birth had just added $2 to a debt that might never be paid? There was no way to know. The photograph captured a single moment, and Louisa's thoughts were not part of the record, but the image itself was a kind of testimony. It showed that she had been there, that Clara had been there, that someone had thought this moment worth preserving, even if the reasons were tangled up in commerce and control. 2 weeks later, Nadine received an email from a woman named Denise Colbert in Chicago. The woman had seen a brief mention of the archive's new acquisitions in a regional history newsletter and noticed the reference to photographs from the Colson place. She wanted to know more. It turned out that Denise was a descendant of people who had lived at Colson Camp. Her great-great-grandmother had been born there in the 1870s and had eventually moved north during the Great Migration. The family had kept few records from that era, just some names and approximate dates passed down through oral tradition. Denise was trying to fill in the gaps. Nadine met with her over video call. She showed her the photograph and explained what she had found. Denise was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My grandmother used to talk about a blanket. She said her mother told her that when babies were born at the camp, they wrapped them in white cloth with writing on it. She thought it was like a christening thing, something religious. She didn't know it was a plantation stamp." The families weren't told, Nadine said, or if they were, they weren't told what it meant in terms of debt and record keeping. The system was designed to be invisible. Denise asked if the woman in the photograph could be her ancestor. Nadine said it was possible, but she would need to do more research to confirm. The name Louisa was common, and there were several women of that age listed in the camp register. But even if it's not your direct ancestor, Nadine said, this photograph is part of your family's story. It documents the system that your ancestors lived under, and it shows that they were there, that they existed, that they held their children and hoped for something better. Denise nodded. "Can you make sure that story gets told? Not the cleaned-up version, the real one." Nadine said she would try. The pushback Dr. Vance had predicted came quickly. A local historical society, funded in part by descendants of Delta planter families, sent a letter expressing concern about politicized interpretations of archival materials. A member of the university's board of trustees called Dr. Vance directly to ask why the archive was digging up old controversies. A columnist for a regional newspaper wrote a piece arguing that focusing on the negative aspects of Reconstruction was divisive and ignored the genuine efforts made by white Southerners to help freed people after the war. Nadine collected these responses in a folder. She was not surprised by them. She had seen similar reactions before, whenever an institution tried to tell a story that complicated the comfortable narratives that had been built over generations. But she also received other messages. A historian at Howard University offered to collaborate on a larger study of birth registration practices in post-war labor camps. A documentary filmmaker in Atlanta asked if she could feature the photograph in a project about medical exploitation of black communities. A genealogist in Mississippi reached out to say that she had found similar stamps on textiles in her own family's collection and had never understood what they meant. The photograph was beginning to do what photographs could do when they were read carefully. It was opening doors. In the end, the archive agreed to include the photograph in a new exhibit on Reconstruction-era Mississippi, with full context provided. The label would explain the blanket stamp, the registration fees, the mortality data, and the connection to ongoing debt bondage. Denise Colbert was invited to contribute a statement about her family's history, which would be displayed alongside the image. The exhibit opened 6 months later. Nadine stood in the gallery on the first day, watching visitors move through the space. Some paused at the photograph for only a moment before moving on. Others stood for several minutes, reading the label, looking at the image, reading the label again. One woman, elderly and white, approached Nadine and asked if she was the curator. Nadine said she was. The woman looked at the photograph and shook her head slowly. "I grew up near there," she said. "My family had a place in Bolivar County. We always heard stories about how our ancestors helped the freed people after the war, gave them land, gave them work. I never heard anything about this." She gestured at the label. "Fees for registering babies, blankets from the slave hospital. Is this really true?" Nadine said it was documented in the county records. The woman was quiet. Then she said, "I don't know what to do with this." Nadine did not have an easy answer. She said, "I think you just sit with it for a while, and then maybe you ask what else you don't know." The woman nodded and walked away. Louisa and Clara remained on the wall, the mother holding her daughter in a moment that had been frozen for over 150 years. The photograph had been taken to record something, but what it recorded depended on who was looking. For the plantation's ledger keepers, it might have been an inventory item, a notation in a column of debts. For Louisa, it might have been a TB rare chance to be seen, to have her child seen, to make a small claim on permanence in a world that offered her almost none. And now, for the people who stood before it in the gallery, it was something else again. It was evidence of a system that had tried to erase itself, to fold back into the normal and the respectable, to disappear into a clean white blanket. But the stamp had remained, the ledgers had remained, the names had remained, and someone eventually had looked closely enough to see. This is what old photographs can do when we refuse to accept them at face value. They are not windows into the past. They are arguments, constructed by people with interests and intentions. The peaceful portrait, the loving family, the clean cloth, these were choices made by photographers and subjects, and sometimes by the systems that surrounded them. The details that do not fit, the stamps and the shadows and the objects held just out of frame, are often where the real story begins. There are thousands of photographs like this one in archives across the South. Images that seem to show one thing but contain, in their margins, evidence of something else. Portraits of prosperous families that do not mention the servants standing just outside the frame. Pictures of children in clean clothes that do not explain where those clothes came from or what debts were attached to them. Photographs of land and houses that do not acknowledge who cleared that land or built those houses or what happened to them afterward. Every time we look at one of these images and accept the simple story, we participate in a kind of forgetting. And every time we look closer, we participate in a kind of remembering. Louisa held Clara in the spring of 1871. The blanket was white, the stamp was faint, and somewhere in a ledger, a man wrote down a name and a fee. We know this now because someone refused to look away.